We often talk about the great sorting that is underway between red and blue states. We had Governor Ron DeSantis. If you missed it, by the way, you definitely want to hear it. So you should subscribe to the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton Show podcast. We also have deep dives. I did a deep dive with Gordon Chang on China earlier this week. That is now up in that feed. You can listen to it, but that's not going to be on radio, only on the podcast. Second hour of the program today, we talked to Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. And he's both doing a book tour and a victory lap simultaneously for the numbers in his state. 50-year low in crime in the state of Florida. That's pretty remarkable. And they also have 800,000, give or take, new residents in the state of Florida. It's got to be probably close to 21, 22 million people now living in that state. But crime is going down. Contrast that with what we see in Chicago, the third largest city in America, and what's going on with their crime rate. Let's see where we are right now. In 2020, the year of the BLM riots, there were 772 murders in Chicago alone. That is a crazy high figure when you think Chicago has 2 million people. So New York is 4 times the size of Chicago, and that is a higher per capita murder rate by the numbers than New York would have had in its absolute worst year in 1990. So at New York's absolute worst, going back now 30 years, Chicago in 2020 was worse. And it hasn't gotten a whole lot better by the numbers either. Just last year, Clay, Chicago had 695 homicides, just shy of 700 murders.
And you saw one nearly yourself, Buck. You'd never been to Chicago, and you and your then fiance went there, and right at one of the main tourist attractions, there was a murder right after you left.
I feel like I had this real Chicago experience in a sense because I'm there with Carrie. We hadn't gotten engaged yet, but yes, my now wife. And I'd never been to Chicago before, which I know was crazy because I've been to Baghdad multiple times. You feel like I probably could make my way to Chicago, and it's beautiful. It's an amazing city. I mean, the downtown is awesome. The architecture, the history, the food. The Chicago River, there's so much good stuff. And, you get to Lake Michigan and the park. And I mean, I was doing the whole tourist thing, and I'm at the Bean, the Silver Bean, in Millennium Park. It's a gorgeous day. And I look at Carrie and I say, this place is pretty great. Maybe the crime thing isn't as bad as we've been led to believe. We're sitting at dinner, maybe an hour and a half later. A murder happened at the Bean. At the Bean. Someone was shot and killed right where we were standing, within 100 yards of where we had that conversation an hour later. So, you could say that's just anecdotal, but what are the chances? Okay, there's obviously a huge problem with crime in Chicago. And this brings me, Clay, to the mayor's race. We've seen some heavy hitters on the Democrat side go down in elections recently. Gavin Newsom managed to keep his job, but you've obviously had some prosecutors, some mayors who have found out that there are limits, right? There are limits to how poorly you can run a city. You had Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, got booted as a prosecutor. There's an effort to get rid of Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. Lori Lightfoot, I think you'd have to say, now people from some other cities may argue on this point, that's fine. But for a city of that size, she's the worst mayor in America. I think that's fair to say. Do you know that she won election with 73% of the vote? 73% of the vote. And now there are 9 people total running. It's likely to go to a runoff. But every single one of the people who are running is a Democrat. You have to wonder. I mean, I would want to ask the people of Chicago, what is more important than putting somebody in charge who takes public safety seriously and is going to back police and bring the crime rate down? Like, what could be a more important reason to cast your vote as a Chicagoan than that?
It's a good point, too. As you mentioned, that all 9 are Democrats. Lori Lightfoot may not even make the runoff. We'll find out tonight. Some of the polling, obviously regular caveats surrounding polling, some of the polling suggests she's not even in the top 3 contenders right now. That's how little of support she will have. So we'll see whether she makes the runoff. Big picture question for the Midwest, Buck. We know that the election's going to be decided there in 2024 probably. How did Illinois become the only really dyed-in-the-wool, reliable blue state in the entire Midwest? Isn't it kind of interesting? Right? Like, you've got Michigan, which Trump won in 2016. You've got Minnesota, which Trump nearly won. Very competitive. Pennsylvania, which is very competitive. Indiana and Ohio are dyed-in-the-wool red. Iowa, I'm talking about Big Ten states now. Iowa, I'll toss into that equation as well. Illinois is the only state in the middle part of the country, right? Take away from the coast. The only state in the middle part of the country where you can be like, there's no way it's not voting blue. And I know Chicago is a big part of that. Chicago's third biggest city in the United States after New York and L.A., and I'm sure Chicago dominates to a certain extent the overall voting patterns of Illinois. But isn't that kind of crazy that Illinois, in the entire middle part of the country, of all states that are not on a coast, Illinois is the most reliably blue in the country. And I'm not even sure what maybe Minnesota you would say is the second most reliably blue in the country off the coast. It's kind of wild, isn't it? That it standing alone is not competitive and not even open to the idea of voting Republican.
I mean, certainly you can look at the history of American progressivism, and you'll take it all the way back to Wisconsin, actually. Wisconsin was a hotbed of progressivism in the early 20th century. But to your point, it's obviously a state that can go red or blue. Illinois is just written off every single presidential election. It's going blue. There's no question. I think Chicago accounts for about 25% of the population of the state. So that's obviously.
But doesn't that kind of surprise you that every other state other than on the coast is, in theoretically, could go red or blue? Illinois is the bluest of any state that is other than the coast.
Yeah. And Springfield, I think, I've been to Springfield, Illinois. It's, I think it's almost a red. I think it's 50-50. It's almost red. So it's not that big of a city. But so there, you do have some other places, other population centers that are more of a toss-up. But look, I just would want to see, why would anybody think that Lori Lightfoot will do a better job a second time around? I do believe that a big part of her appeal to the progressive Democrat vote in Chicago the first time around falls under the diversity and identity politics component of not just being the first black female mayor of Chicago, the first black female LGBTQ plus mayor of Chicago. I think that they were celebrating that, obviously. That was considered some major milestone for the city of Chicago. But now they've seen the results, and you have to wonder, why would anyone expect the results to be different if they gave her another term? She was elected, Clay, on a platform largely of reforming corruption in the police force. Oh, okay. The police were a city that has gun violence stretching back for decades. The problem is we haven't been hard enough on the cops. This is a fallacy from progressives.
I'm curious how this plays out, because I think that she is almost assuredly going to lose. And if she is almost assuredly going to lose, my question would be, is this going to be seen as a shot at the diversity and inclusion mafia? I think it's fair to call them like a mafia, because Biden was bragging yesterday, if you saw it, Buck, about this is the most diverse cabinet that's ever existed. And I saw a good ad that was put out by Stephen Miller's group, and it really brought it home. Do you ever walk onto an airplane and think, man, I hope the pilots are really diverse here? Or if you're rushing into a hospital because you've got somebody injured in your family, do you think, oh, man, I hope they have a really diverse ER staff here? Or do you think, I want the best damn person flying this plane or taking care of my injured family member? And the reason why I bring that up is there has been this diversity and inclusion mafia where, oh, we have to have Lori Lightfoot in the mayor's office because she's a black lesbian. And then you're like, okay, that's fine. But then she gets in and does an awful job. And I wonder if that's going to destroy some of this cosmetic theater aspect of, let's pick the best person for the job, regardless of what their background is from a pure identity politics perspective.
This obviously has come up, this concept has come up in the context of airline pilots and and air traffic controllers and some of the issues that we've seen recently. I know Tucker has raised this on his show on Fox. The one of the fundamental problems of the diversity and inclusion mantra is that you always see this when this is implemented as the loosening of objective standards to achieve more diversity and inclusion. Essentially, and maybe the most obvious example of this, there's a lot of them, would be in the military, right? You change, okay, we need more combat Marines who are female. The only way you're getting more combat capable Marines who are female at the numbers they want is to stop caring about how fast can you run with a pack on you, how accurately can you fire after marching 8 miles. I mean, all of the basics of infantry tactics and ability, you have to change the standards. And then what they do is they change the standards, whatever objective metrics the profession has, and you're a bad person if you say, hold on a second, you're changing the standards. So that means we're going to have, in the aggregate, a lower quality of candidate in that arena, in that skill set, in that profession, right? You're going to have somebody who is less capable than you would have if you had a different standard set. Again, in the military context, this is the most clear. The Pentagon did a huge study of Marines, and what did it show? I mean, catastrophic differences in the combat capability of male, female, forward deployed units when the standards are held the same as well, how are we supposed to, this is where the cognitive dissonance comes in. If they're going to make a police force more diverse and inclusive by making it easier by the numbers and by the testing and everything else to become a police officer, eliminating criminal background checks, et cetera, whatever it is they're going to do, well, then you're going to have a less capable police force, aren't you? Or then what's the point of the standards in the first place?
Which directly could be argued to tie in to what happened to Tyree Nichols in Memphis. Right? There is an argument that the lessening of standards in the Memphis Police Department allowed those 5 police officers to be in a position where they may well, based on the footage we saw, have committed murder of Tyree Nichols. By the way, how quickly did that story vanish, Buck? Tyree Nichols' video, far worse than, in my opinion, the George Floyd video, right? If you look at what they did to him.
Yes, that was murder by cop. They beat him. They beat a man in custody to death. That is what happened there. We saw that right away. Yeah, and they stopped. That has the BLM. No marches whatsoever. None of that. I mean, sorry. For 24 hours there were some marches over the week, and then it all faded away. No riots, I should say, which is a good thing, by the way. But it's interesting that the left treats the circumstance so very differently. I just bring it back to Chicago. I would want to ask the residents of Chicago, what else has to happen here for you to want somebody more competent, capable, and who believes in police more and doesn't play diversity and inclusion politics with every major decision, especially decisions that involve keeping people alive, public safety, stopping old ladies of all colors from being mugged, beaten, robbed, and all people, not just old ladies. What else has to happen?
It's a great question. Maybe we'll find out some of these results coming in from Chicago tonight. Buck, you're talking about the race that's about to happen in Chicago, currently actually happening. People are voting today for the mayor of Chicago. We'll talk about what happened there tomorrow. But the D.C. Police Union, Washington, D.C., tweeted this out over the last, 20 hours ago. Homicides so far this year are up 40% in Washington, D.C. over last year. Remember, we're talking about elevated homicide rates already. Sexual assaults are up 123%. Vehicle theft up 111%. All crime up 25%. They are having a real difficulty getting cops to do the job there. This also is from one of the members of the D.C. Police Union. There were 9 murders over the weekend alone in Washington, D.C. And when you start talking, they've had 35 homicides already so far in 2023. So we're about to finish off 2 months. They're up 40%. This is not going away. And this is Joe Biden's backyard right now in Washington, D.C. And do you know how people are responding there? There are not enough cops, but they are deciding to limit the punishments even more on the violent predators that they are arresting on D.C. city streets. Now, I went to college in D.C. Buck, you were talking about the fact that you lived in D.C. and obviously born and raised in New York City. D.C. has always been a violent city, but to have the homicide rate skyrocketing like this is pretty insane.
Also see that there's a hesitancy from people, I think, Clay, in some of these cities to do what would turn this around because it would give politically useful tools to the other side, effectively doing what you think would be what the Republicans want, for example, is something Democrats just won't do, even if it would save lives. In the case of Chicago, you know that Vallis, who is one of the main opponents of Lori Lightfoot, she keeps saying he's a Democrat. She keeps calling him a Republican. This is the way. And so you see in a lot of these Democrat-controlled cities, there's a hesitancy to change course, I think, because they realize that would be an admission. If you're going to hire more cops, if you're going to have the plainclothes anti-crime unit back on the beat, if you're going to do these things, it is a de facto admission that what your opponents have been saying, in this case, people right of center, were right all along.
I think there is an opportunity now, Buck, for a lot of different city versions of Rudy Giuliani. Chicago, L.A., going forward, somebody who is a Republican and just says, I'll just fix things. I'll just make it safe for you to be able to be out in the streets with your family. That's where we're headed right now.